do it.
Hello, hi there, welcoming an amazing person that I love catching up about agility and all things in the world of tech with. It's Michael Grieder. Hello, Michael, how are you?
Hey, Susie, doing well.
And can I invite you to introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. So my name is Michael. I'm located and based in Switzerland, and I am a user research manager at Adobe, and also focusing on a lot of UX related topics outside of Adobe.
Cool. And as some of our viewers might be aware, we we've been working in our respective tech aspects of work, right? Because I work as an Agile coach in the tech sector. And even though I knew you already, I was absolutely mesmerized watching a webinar that you did about metrics and return on investment. And with my background, having created the metrics and chill approach for teams articulating the value and kind of really buying into and getting ownership and feeling empowered through metrics and telling their story through data, it just brought a whole new dimension to how I saw you, Michael. And we had a great conversation, right? Where we talked all things, like from your perspective and my perspective. And we thought actually we wanted to do a bit of experimentation together, didn't we, around tech?
Absolutely. And I think like trying to combine those areas, agility and UX, user research, what sounded super interesting to me. And when you reached out to me asking if we want to start something, I was super pumped about it. And I think there is a lot of value and having us and other people talking about those two key areas.
Yeah.
And where it actually overlaps, right? And where the gaps are and what the challenges are.
Yeah, and I know that you're way too modest to say this for yourself, so I will say it for you. It's really obvious how inspirational a leader you are in the work you do and your thinking around this. I think the thing that really struck me was there are a lot of people, including in the tech industry, right, that talk about understanding customer need, about understanding customer voice, about caring about what the customer wants, about delighting customers. But as we know, talking about it and doing it can be two very different things, in the same way as doing Agile and being Agile are not necessarily the same thing. And so I think, it's an appropriate time to say that as we were exploring what we might like to cover in this vlog together, we came up with an all-encompassing title, right? And I feel psychologically safe to say my memory does not retain everything we talked about. So I've got my little crib sheet here. So I will unapologetically rustle it. I feel like a newsreader.
All good. That's good. You're good.
So the title we came up with, which I was really delighted about, was Putting the Personal Back into Personas. So do you want to just share a bit about, how did we arrive? What's your recollection of how we came up with that title for this vlog?
Yeah, I think we made it. We had a whole journey, and we started somewhere, and then we ended up somewhere else, and then at the end, I think it was right at the end, and where we talked about personas and how people and companies rely on those personas, and then we talked about the pro and cons of doing personas, and that personas might not be the answer to every question. And I think that like adding the psychologic aspect into the whole thing, and I think that's how we ended up using that title.
Exactly. That's my recollection as well, Michael, that like we said, you and I were both very immersed in agile ways of working and in that tech environment. And absolutely user personas can be massively powerful, right, in terms of helping us adjust our mindset and how we're looking, our perceptual positioning, from an NLP perspective, I guess, understanding, who are these people, who are these customers, because let's face it, and I'm not making any comments here about any individual organization, but it's a very, very understandable human thing that, you know, as we're all very busy and we're very focused on our day-to-day work, how can people not lose sight quite easily of naturally drifting, you know, towards focusing on the day-to-day sprints and the stories, and actually sometimes losing sight of who we're doing it for. And I remember we talked about user personas, and as you said, you know, that thing around, let's not get fixated on user personas, even in sectors where it's very, very powerful, because if we're not careful, we can overinvest so much and persuade ourselves that these user personas that are actually much more needing to be the focus than other mechanisms for listening to customers and designing and delivering tech on that basis. And the other thing I remember that we felt very inspired about, and you touched on it slightly earlier, Michael, I think we felt quite excited, right, about bringing together the dialogue around this in terms of customer voice and responding to customer voice, and how do we measure our impact and return on an investment by bringing together those discussions from a UI perspective, UX perspective, and agility, because it's weird, isn't it, right? Because we often coexist, all these different roles coexist daily, and yet there isn't a lot out there where people kind of bring the two, the two worlds together, I suppose. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think it's not an obvious connection, right? There is not an obvious connection, but I think Agile has on the other hand an obvious connection to basically everything we do, especially in tech. There are so many different elements where Agile is a part, in one company more than the other, and one do it and one live it. But I think that it is an interesting combination, because I think there is much more where Agile and user research has in common.
Yeah, and I know through metrics and chill as well, one of the things that I encourage people to do is to think more broadly about what metrics they're using, you know, and actually spot synergies, because in the way that you and I have explored through our discussions, and, you know, I'm excited about us getting into that a bit more in this vlog, actually, even though, as we said, sometimes inadvertently those conversations about understanding customer need and desires for our products can become quite silo in terms of those specialisms. Actually, we could probably save a lot of money and time by having those more direct conversations, right? There might be some of the measurement that might actually tick boxes for everybody.
Exactly. I think a key piece there is we should try to get the feedback much faster than we do. And we can kind of apply the Agile framework to it, and rather focus on one tiny nugget of the whole research plan, and try to get this specific question as fast as possible. Meaning that we shouldn't spend a lot of time thinking about the sample sizes. We don't need to talk to hundreds of customers if we just want to have this specific question answered. We should be okay with a couple of them, and like doing the math, the calculation, it will tell us like, well, if we talk to 7 people, we should already know 80% of everything. Like if we're not working in a medical environment, we don't need to go up to that 100, because the bandwidth and the amount of costs which will get added from those 80% to 100% are like going up like crazy, right?
Yes. So that whole kind of Pareto principle thing, I've never heard it applied in that way. But you also made a comment there, you said about Agile framework. And I remember one of the things that stuck in my mind from our conversation was around the Agile manifesto. And what can we actually learn, or what can we take from the Agile manifesto that might inform, you know, strengthening this kind of dialogue across the disciplines. And I'd noted down, you know, there was something that we touched on, which I'd like to explore a bit more here. So it was this idea, right, that sometimes what can happen in organizations, even those that claim to be very agile, is that people can get so obsessed about the agile frameworks that it actually becomes to the detriment of listening to customer voice? I mean, what do you make of that? What are your experiences and views on that?
Yeah, I think that's what we see with a lot of things, right? If people are like trying to hold on so much on the actual process, they will lose track about what they actually care about, right? So I think like having a good balance between like this is the Agile Manifesto, but for our use case, it might not apply 100%. So like having this flexibility to adjust things as you need, I think it's one key element. And I think especially in big companies, processes are what's holding together the company, right? So I know why people are afraid of stepping one side away from the process, or like just even not follow the process 100%. So I kind of understand, and I think that's what we need to do more. Just like go one step back and ask ourselves, what do we need, right? What do we need as a team? What do we need as a company? And what could work best for us? And not just using a process and say like, this is a process we have to follow, right? I think like being creative about even just like, it might just be picking something about from the Agile process, picking something from another process. And you can also mix it up together, right? If that's what works for you.
Yeah, I love that about your approach, and that came over really strongly from the webinar that you spoke at, and how you described the work that you'd done, you know, about experimentation and then actually, but still bringing it back to that tangible kind of very logical approach about measuring and quantifying the return on investment, which, you know, I'm a massive advocate of. And I think when people haven't tried to do that, you know, they either go to one end of the spectrum. They either say, don't they, no, that's way too difficult, we can't do that, so we're not even going to try. Or they go to the other end where it's like, well, get on with it, it should just be easy. You know, it's kind of between. But with you, but through the lens of looking at how do we bring that dialogue together, you know, in terms of UI and Agile, and how do we kind of really bring that dialogue together in a very powerful way to tune into customer voice, to really kind of cross-fertilize, help each other, you know, really design product that customers will love and will delight them. There is something there, right, in the Agile Manifesto in terms of, you know, working software over comprehensive documentation, because it strikes me what you're describing there, again, a very agile principle, that idea that we're trying to deliver value early, right? You know, some people, they always want to see things in their entirety and think, oh, you know, it's not going to make sense if we have that little fragment of it. But as we know, I mean, customer taste can change so rapidly, right? You know, particularly for some products. So, you know, if we're always waiting to have the full picture, that can be very, very difficult. So it strikes me that we almost need some kind of, you know, moving ability, you know, rolling ability to tune in and listen to the voice and measure that. I mean, how have you found that in your own experience in terms of making that a sustained but evolving process?
We actually had to do research first before we actually were sure about what we want to do, and we had to listen to every stakeholder and listen to each of them, and everyone had an own idea and own way of thinking about metrics and KPIs. So we had to really think about what are our stakeholders looking for. And I think the balance between having a metric which tells you enough, but is not overcomplicated, right? So we started pretty super slow by just saying like, well, let's focus on one task which is not changing over time in our product. Oh, that's the task we can actually measure on, right? Let's just focus on the specific task, like say, and then we could be creative around it, saying like, okay, what do we have already? Is there any tracking software behind, like an analytics tool, which could tell us how long it took a person, how many clicks the person did? So there are a lot of things already in place which you could use. And like companies are like people or teams. come to you quite often, like asking for those big research questions,
Yes.
which are doable. But I think that's where you talk about like software over documentation, right? Like coming with a big research question would be the documentation part because research, especially user research, includes a lot of like written reports. So that would be the documentation part. But you could also answer one of those questions by doing the software, the smaller piece, and just focus on one tiny step.
Yes, and that's brilliant. And there's two things that dawn on me there. So first of all, again, that thing with Agile Manifesto, in that instance you gave, that is completely appropriate, right? And as you know, I mean, in my previous life in education, I worked in education for nearly 20 years from an education research background as well. And inevitably, there are some times when, even if you're working Agile, some of that stuff is fundamental, right, to understanding the customer need. And I think people forget sometimes. So even on that particular thing, working software over comprehensive documentation, it's not that the comprehensive documentation doesn't have its place in particular instances. And as we know, where we see some highly dysfunctional teams, it's often where they say, oh, we're working Agile, we don't document anything. It's like, no, that's not really the way it works. Yeah. Exactly, that's not the way it works. So that's one thing I think that absolutely is. And I think this thing around really tuning into customer need, it is such a complex thing. Like you say, even if your sample size is pretty small, really getting into the psychology of what is motivating a customer to want particular features or functionality or what have you, that's a really in-depth process, right? That's not just necessarily a surface level questionnaire. So that's the first thing. And the second thing which resonated with me when you said that, Michael, was again that classic thing, right, in Scrum, for example, in terms of sprint reviews, and having that dialogue, having that two-way dialogue with your stakeholders, and not just because product ownership, of course, plays a crucial role, I think, in terms of getting closer to that customer voice, where it works really well. And then directly, obviously, informs the development because the product owner is very clearly articulating and communicating those customer needs. But I'm curious, from your perspective, from a UX perspective, what kind of key success factors do you think you have seen contribute to really understanding customer voice, and then that helping to later measure, the impact that you've had?
It's hard to pick a specific key metric because as always it depends.
Yes. Oh yeah,
there
true.
Are so many, and going back to the persona thing, it is hard to tie one specific metric to more than one teams. There are standards which we use. Mm-hmm. But I always like to go back to the team and asking what they're looking for, and then I can kind of advocate as a UX researcher on which are the metrics which could be used. And that's why I talked at the webinar when I was talking about UX benchmarking and talking about this QX score, which is the quality of experience score, which is actually a pretty new standard and a standard way of getting feedback and coming up with a metric, because it includes two key elements. One is behavior and the attitudinal side, which are two very well-known areas in research, especially UX research, and that's the only score which is actually able to combine those two things.
Fascinating, yeah. And I think the thing is as well, and I know we're both massively passionate about this area, and I'm going off script a bit, I'm going off piste a bit, Michael, because we didn't touch on this question, but it seems like an obvious question to ask at this point. When people are so busy day to day, right? I mean, we in our roles, because we're passionate about it, we've got quite a lot of agency, right, to encourage people to experiment about this stuff and try and encourage them to think about things differently. What do you find, what do you think in your experience tend to be kind of objections or key blockers, to people actually thinking about opportunities in this kind of way?
I think one of my key elements is include rather than convince. That's my
Yeah, love
that's
that.
my
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, me too.
I know, yeah, there is a term in user research where we talk about toxic people, which are basically people who don't believe in what you do. I'm not a huge fan of that term because I don't think they are toxic people. They're just people talking a different language or having
Okay.
a different idea. So that's why I rather include than convince people. I know from time to time you have to convince someone, but you could also convince that person by including him, and then it will be his own like idea of like, well, it's actually a good point you take. So I think the way how you approach people is super important. And we all know it, right? If it's something new, everything new is can be threatening to you. So make sure you're talking the same language as your counterpart or as your opponent.
Well, speaking of, speaking that same language as well, another aspect that I'm interested in, and I'm thinking of any organizations now, not just tech, if we think about the priority that people place on listening to customer voice and then following up with trying to find a way to measure and capture that impact and the return on investment. How do we, as an economy, I suppose, as a group of people here in the world working across various sectors, how do we make that difference? How do we actually make that shift, do you think, to, all people in different roles in organizations understanding why that's important? Or is that not important? Is it mainly senior leadership where you feel that there's the most potential to message around this? Have you got a view on that?
I think I do. So especially when we talk about like the value of voice of the customer or any user feedback, I think we should pay more attention to it. Looking at the big software companies or even big hardware companies, looking at Apple as example, they do good products. They don't have much more margin to do better products. So what is their main driver to sell the product is the usability and the happiness of their customers. So you should actually make sure the happiness, you should make sure that you're actually listening to your customers because that's an area where you still can grow, right?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I don't know whether I think you heard that recently, didn't you? I think I saw that you liked the vlog I did with Rich Sheridan from Menlo Innovations, about joy metrics. And, that conversation was partially inspired by you as well, because, if we think around technology, and this is where metrics and chill comes from, right? Anybody working in tech is always going to have kind of standard conventional reporting things that they feed back on, right? That's a given. And that's not just a tech thing, right? But you are right. If I think about, even use of tech, with my own children in the house and sort of how they interact with technology, you're absolutely right. That happiness thing is massive. And again, we know, right, that happiness, yes, we can use all kinds of different ways of measuring it, but infamously, that's one of the least tangible, in theory, metrics that we go with. So, I mean, how do you approach that from a UX point of view in terms of turning those, as I say it, I like saying, quantifying the unquantifiable? How do you approach that?
There is a set of standard questions which you can use to actually tackle down the happiness point a little bit. But I think happiness is also, you can also, whenever we do remote usability studies, we talk to those people through the screen, but we talk to them. And I think getting a nice quote in the end, or just hearing someone saying like, well, that's actually a nice feature. I think this will help me achieving whatever I want to.
Yes.
It's also something, and you can basically just like do a scorecard, right? And give yourself like every time the person is like happy about something, give it a score, give it a 1, give it a 2.
Yeah, and just extending on that, you've just got me thinking, and again, I'm going off script again. If we think about, for example, where teams are writing user stories, and they've got their acceptance criteria, again, I mean, my experience as an agile coach, and I'm saying this in the round, you know, from when I worked in education and construction as well as tech, I tend to find that people will zone in on how you do acceptance criteria, right? And that is really good, because obviously knowing the approach is really important in terms of them holding themselves accountable and making that judgment, you know, right, actually, have we fulfilled what we were aiming for? But I find that even those teams that are very, very high performing, you know, they've got that kind of flow state going on, they're aware of the wider organization. If we're lucky, they may link it to a business need. Okay. So even if they've linked it to an epic, right, because an epic would obviously tend to be more linked to the strategic type stuff. But so if we're lucky, we might sort of verbally at least have people, as they're talking about crafting the acceptance criteria, talking about how it then links strategically to the vision of what the organization is there to do. But do you think that even at that level, do you think sort of even within the user stories and, you know, the acceptance criteria, do you think, should there be a much more conscious focus on weaving the relevance to responding to customer feedback in every time? And if so, how do we do that when people are so busy?
Yeah, so for the first part of your question, I think we should do it way more often. So we should do it. It's something everyone should do more. Mm. And for the second part, that's the key question, right? So I think it needs to be something which is easy and adjustable, right? Adjustable in terms of, if it doesn't work, try something new without losing weeks of work, right? So like aim for the low-hanging fruit, and I'm pretty sure there is always a low-hanging fruit. You just need to find it. I think that's
Yes, I love that. And there's just one more thought from my point of view, Michael, and I think again it comes down to like the cultural kind of conditions, because I know for a fact, I know if you and I were working in the same organization, we would just be bouncing ideas off each other all the time, right? And saying, hey, come on, everybody, let's listen to the customers and kind of, you know, make this product stuff line up. But one of the biggest blockers, again, if I think over the years, one of the biggest blockers that I have seen with teams, and that is in spite of some very inspirational messaging from senior leadership. You know, I've actually encountered senior leadership teams that have really, really bent over backwards to, you know, engage with teams, emphasize the importance of listening, tuning into customer need, you know, in terms of designing the product and so forth. But I very often see from within teams themselves, and this is where I love being an agile coach, right? This is one of the things that massively motivates me in my work. In trying to enable those members of teams to feel more connected to that customer need, even if they're not directly in a product ownership role, that is very rewarding for me, because I always see a direct correlation between people feeling connected with that agenda and then how they show up to work, right? You know, understanding why they're there doing what they're doing. And what I've also noticed is that when that happens, I find that the closer that people feel connected from the development to customer, it legitimizes the team culture to innovate and to experiment and to problem solve and think laterally. Because one of the biggest blockers I've seen over the years is teams that are sprinting all the time and they're saying, we haven't got time. Yes, I know we're meant to innovate, but we haven't got time. We haven't got time to innovate. And you know, just almost like this learned helplessness about not building time, for example, into sprints. I mean, my personal preference, and I mean, I don't know, you may do this already from your UX perspective. My personal preference would always be to try and build in some of that listening time to customers as a given in every sprint. or even if it's not every member of a team directly being in contact with customers, even though that obviously is the ideal, right? Especially if it's in conjunction with UX colleagues and you're both learning. But I just don't see that happening very often through my work in Agile coaching. Have you ever experienced teams that have done that before?
Yeah, so usually people learn the best when they actually see and feel it. So when we do, we can talk about the importance and the value of user research as long as we want. If people never saw or never joined a study, you will never get their buy-in unless they are also passionate about user research. So what we do, we always include our designers and even engineers to just be a fly on the wall whenever we do those remote sessions, and then they actually see how the customer is struggling, right? And that is a much more powerful story than any Jira ticket.
Hallelujah!
Could be a blocker, could even be a blocker. It will not have the same weight if the person is like actually seeing it and feeling it, how the customer is struggling or not struggling. It can be both. And then for the second part, like the more teams are knowing that they can reach out or that someone can help them getting feedback, the more creative they can be. Because what is the potential big blocker in our head is, oh, I'm going to fail. I cannot afford to fail. But if you would include user research as you go, you would know, like, well, the worst thing which can happen is person doesn't like it, so I will go back 2 days and start over.
Yes.
So I think that's a shift, a paradigm shift in our head, which is blocking us, right? If we actually know that we are not allowed to fail.
Exactly. Yeah. And that paradigm shift, right? I mean, from an Agile coaching point of view, that's like well, certainly my perception of Agile coaching and the value that it's there to add. That's very much a big part of it. So Michael, I have absolute confidence in all your future work and experimentation on this, that you'll fully involve your Agile coaches, as I'm sure you do already. And
yeah, I'm doing my best.
And I am very much looking forward to our own further exploration of this, which obviously at some point we'll update people, right, as we get further into this.
We will.
Right. Okay, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise. And very excited to see what comes next. So keep doing good in the world of customer voice and metrics and return on investment.
Likewise, keep being passionate about Agile and keep your open mind.
Fabulous. All right, Michael, look after yourself. Thanks for your time.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.